What I want to do in this report is give a little description of the academic seminar Roadblock that took place on the 6th of July at Faslane in Scotland on the Clyde, outside the base that houses Britain's nuclear submarine fleet, the Trident submarines, which is just round the corner basically from the castle of the Muses here in Argyll. And I went along because the presence of these nuclear submarine fleets just close to the castle is a kind of ethical dilemma for Britain and for the world as a whole. Nuclear weapons are obviously a major problem on the planet. They cost an awful lot of money. They are inherently unstable and dangerous, and statistically speaking, we've only had nuclear weapons for about 62 years or so. Probability if we're going to have them around as a planet for another 100 or 200 years, the chances are some kind of accident will eventually happen. And the problem is that unlike bows and arrows, nuclear weapons have the potential for global mass destruction. So from an ethical perspective, the sooner the globe can negotiate a way of disarming nuclearly, collectively, universally, and for the common good. I think it's a philosophical challenge facing the global thinking community from all cultures, all religions, all nations. It's one of the great ethical challenges of our time, and Einstein, whose science really fundamentally underlay the discovery of nuclear weapons, campaigned for the last few decades of his life trying to find a rational way of controlling them and ultimately getting rid of them. Bertrand Russell and many other philosophers also campaigned. John Somerville founded the International Philosophers for the Prevention of Nuclear Omnicide, IPNO, which was set up in 1983 in Montreal at the World Congress of Philosophy, and I, meanwhile, in parallel, unbeknownst to each other, had set up Philosophers and Historians for Peace in London with John Francis Phipps back in 1983-4. We used to have meetings in Ledbury Road in Notting Hill Gate, and eventually discovered about the existence of each other. I attended the IPNO conference in University of Sussex in 1988, was then European coordinator for Philosophers for Peace. And then in 1990 I went to Moscow to the IPNO conference and met many Russian philosophers from all over the planet, other thinkers from different cultures, Greece, Egypt, Britain, the States, and so on, and was elected coordinator of Philosophers for Peace globally. And that was in 1990. Subsequently, I went on to found the International Institute of Peace Studies and Global Philosophy, having worked at the University of London to investigate the feasibility of creating an Institute of Peace Studies. So all this work, obviously, has meant that I've spent a lot of time thinking through the ethics of not just nuclear weapons, but violence and war and conflict in general. So at this academic seminar yesterday, I gave a paper which was called Towards a Philosophy of Peace, and I'm going to summarise that briefly in a minute. But before I do, I'm going to report on a little more about the background to this event and who else was there. The idea for these academic seminar roadblocks taking place at nuclear bases around the world is really a new one. It's academia getting off its backside and actually getting out and engaging with some of the real issues of the planet, which is something I myself have been doing since the late 80s when I got involved with the University of London Peace Studies Initiative. And a book has recently been published called Tackling Trident, Academics in Action Through Academic Conference Blockades, edited by S. Vinthagen, J. Kenrick and Kelvin Mason. This is available through the internet, and it's a study of these kind of academic protests. And the first one apparently took place in Faslane in 2005, and so there was also one in 2007, and in one or two other places around the planet. So the idea of these academic seminars is a practical way of thinking through the issues, actually. I certainly don't see it as a kind of... I think it would be arrogant for academics to argue that they know absolutely all there is to know about the ethics and the complex policy issues to do with nuclear weapons. And I'll explain in my discourse a bit later what I had to say yesterday. I think all true academics have to have a measure of humility and not knowing. It was Socrates that taught the academy that sometimes not knowing is the most intelligent response to complex issues. Then you can advance knowledge a little bit at a time in the areas of not knowing. So anyway, here we are. They came together. It was actually a sunny day outside the base. It was very beautiful. There were about 30 people gathered from all over the country. People had come up from England, from Yorkshire, from Wales, from London, from other parts of Scotland, and joined the regulars who live at the Peace Camp, more or less opposite the Faslane nuclear base. And there was some very interesting and lively people. There were also probably somewhere between 30, 40 police at different times of the event. Obviously, they were there in case any kind of violent protests had erupted, which fortunately didn't happen. A few days before, some people had broken into the base at Faslane and caused some alarms, and so simply as a non-violent protest, people had got in and hidden in different parts of the base, which is a criminal act according to the government, and they'd been arrested and dealt with. On this occasion, there were no arrests, and it was a peaceful academic seminar, just as one might have in a conference venue. It's just we were outside the base of the Trident nuclear submarines. I want to summarise, therefore, what happened for those that weren't able to come. So this is a kind of media report, if you want, but it's also an academic reporting back on something in the hope that people who would have liked to be there but couldn't will benefit from it. And a BBC reporter was there filming on behalf of BBC Scotland, and there is a documentary film being made at the moment about the work of the Faslane Peace Camp. So it's possible that this will be aired on television eventually. But he didn't film the majority of the actual discussions, so it's down to me to give a report of that. I expect it might well be written up at some point and perhaps published in another volume. Okay, so the first speaker, there were about 5 official speakers and a chairperson, and it was run pretty much in a formal academic kind of procedure, which was very, very useful. I mean, academics like to come together and discuss ideas, and that's what we were doing. Hopefully of benefit for the common good and for the community of which we're a part. The first speaker was a PhD student from Goldsmiths College working in geography, and who spoke very, very, very well, a prepared paper that she'd given to the Royal Geographical Society at the University of Edinburgh Royal Society of Geography conference recently, and this was a young PhD student candidate called Claire Wiggins, I believe, and her paper was a study of the artwork Targets by Joyce Kozloff, Kozloff, which is a hollow sphere produced in 2000. Joyce Kozloff is an American artist, and the work is an appeal to reconceptualize how we see geography, how we see space, how we see the Earth, and what knowledge is, and how we see the polemics of geographical knowledge. It's a hollowed sphere that you stand in, about 12 foot tall, 10 foot tall, and it's shaped on the outside a bit like a hand grenade. You go in through a door, and it's a sphere, a bit like an Apollo lunar module, you can imagine, although it's a total sphere. And inside are maps in panels which show places around the world that have been targeted by the US military. So there are maps of Vietnam, of Cuba and so on, and Moscow and other places where America has either bombed or has had the potential to. And they're multicolour, they're very attractive looking, they're all in different scales, and there are different, some are up, some are down. Sometimes the text is up and the map down and so on. So it's not like a coherent, boring presentation. It's a multicoloured artwork which gets you to think about targets. What these are all places. These are villages, towns, and so on that have been blown up and bombed. So the person experiencing this artwork goes inside it and really is called to reflect on, what a target is, and also it's a way of showing the world as if it's simply an abstract map. There's no notion in this that the emblems on the map represent real people and real villages and real lives. The thing is done in 2000, so of course since then one could have added the maps of Afghanistan and Iraq, and I mean there's a huge number of new potential targets that Joyce could have put in if this work had been done since 2000. It's a fascinating work. She's been involved in a fusion, as she puts it, of artistic traditions with an activist temperament. Joyce Kozloff herself is an American feminist artist who uses art to make political points, to make statements, if you want. And her website, joycekozloff.net, is full of the details of her life and her public work and so on. She's most recently in 2003 helped install some work at the US consulate in Istanbul, for instance. So she's been adopted to some extent by the artistic establishment of America, and by the political establishment. Anyway, what the doctoral student presented at the seminar, the academic seminar, yesterday was a critique of this work and how it asks us to reconceptualise the way we see the Earth. And she presented it. She had an extremely interesting presentation. I'm sure the paper will be available for people that missed it. And it was widely referenced and a highly interesting study. She spoke for about 20 minutes. Then there were a few discussions, points, questions made, and then it moved on to the second paper, which was my own. And I want to summarise this briefly, a kind of report back. First I introduced myself, Dr. Thomas Daffern. I explained a bit about my background as a historian and philosopher, explained a bit about my work as an international philosopher of peace, my work at the University of London, running the Institute of Peace Studies as a feasibility project first, and then actually launching it with the support of peace academics and specialists around the globe. I mentioned how the original committee had included many scientists and social scientists and historians and thinkers and so on. I then mentioned the work I did at the House of Lords on ethics and peace and policy during the 1990s up to the 2000s, and really a lifetime of service, or half a lifetime hopefully of service, to getting the British and international intellectual community and general mass public to think deeply about the ethics of war and peace and violence and how we can make a peaceful world. I mean, this is, it seems, the greatest challenge of our time. And I explained how I was personally inspired to get involved with this work by working in Canada with veteran soldiers back in the late 70s and early 80s, and learning about the horrors of war, becoming involved with the Quakers, and involved with the Buddhist community, and searching for a kind of spirituality of non-violence that has led to a 30-year in-depth study of all the world's great philosophical and religious traditions, and led to a lifetime's work teaching comparative religion and spirituality, but also political science and philosophy. So anyway, I did a little introduction, and then I spoke. I decided to tailor my talk to the structure of the 9 Muses, because I run the Castle of the Muses as an educational centre here, informal, private peace museum, and we have a programme of meetings and discussions and debates and so on, and I therefore tried to explain just briefly what the Muses are and why they are interested, so to speak, in knowledge and education for peace. Firstly, I explained that when Plato founded the Academy in ancient Athens, he did so as actually a spiritual fraternity under the inspiration and direction of the 9 Muses. And in the Academy in Athens, outside the walls of Athens, where he was given some land which he used to set up his centre, there was a temple of the 9 Muses. Now, Plato, as a great philosopher and Athenian aristocrat, knew the religious traditions of the Athenians and the Greeks in general. He knew the importance of the Muses. Now, the Muses are the daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne. Zeus being the lord of light, the god of consciousness, reason, rationality, justice, and his consort Mnemosyne being the goddess of the underworld, of memory, of the dark, of the moon, of thought, of reflection, of the unconscious. The two together, those two facets of the psyche, to use Jungian language, co-create 9 amazing daughters who represent all the spheres of knowledge and learning. And they were named and known in antiquity, and all schools, colleges and so on used to have a statue or worship centre for the Muses, just as Christian schools will have a little chapel in. So in classical schools they had a little quiet, silent space for the Muses. And to muse means to think deeply. It was the origin also of the word museum, because when the great scholars that set up the Museion in Alexandria, who were a couple of generations after Plato, after Aristotle and Aristotle's student had founded Alexandria, and then it was undertaken by the Ptolemies to create a Museion in Alexandria. Again, that was done in the spirit of these 9 Muses. And the library there in Alexandria became the greatest ever library that the world had seen up to that point, with scrolls from every single culture and civilization they could find, including ancient India, and it's where the Bible was translated into Greek. So the Museion was and they also had a centre, a spiritual centre for the Muses there, like a chapel or temple. So I decided therefore to do my talk according to these 9 Muses and run through them. So I introduced them to the audience, many of whom had never really heard of them and didn't have a clue what these Muses are and what their names are. And most people don't. It was interesting as well that the police were listening quite well, and I hope they learned something too. That mostly young police were policing this event, but 1 or 2 older ones, and I could see them nodding. And I did make the point that I wondered if in their own training at the police academies, wherever they're trained, they ever learn that the word academic comes from a lover of the 9 Muses. So since we were having an academic seminar, I decided to explain who are the line managers of academia globally. Right, the first one, therefore, in the list is Calliope. Now, as I explained, Calliope was always the heroic muse, and she's the muse of the epic poem, and therefore, in today's world, she's the muse of political studies, political science, and economics. The huge struggle we have to try and make sense politically of where the world's going. And I explained that political scientists like to look at the struggle between right, left, centre, green, all the different theories of politics. But unfortunately, all too often, there's conflict and violence between these different wings and factions in politics. And from the Muses' perspective as a whole, what she wants us to do is somehow reach reconciliation. That these people, these political factions, can, instead of always emphasising the differences, can actually emphasise what they have in common and work for the common good of the planet as a whole. And so the work of political scientists is incredibly important. In my own doctoral thesis on transpersonal history, I've looked at the transpersonal dimension of political thought, and I think that, myself personally, that ethics are very important in political action. For me, somebody is a good politician or a bad one if they lie, if they cheat, if they steal, if they're corrupt. They're bad. I don't care if they call themselves right-wing or left-wing. It's irrelevant. It's how they actually act in office. Do they listen to their constituents? Do they try and solve problems that are brought to them as rationally and wisely as possible or not? If not, then I'm afraid I put them in the bad camp. Good politicians or statespeople would be those that think things through holistically, that look at all sides of an argument, that try and find truth, that will speak truth, that will undertake to complete projects they take on, that will follow through on what they say they'll do, and are completely steady as a rock in terms of reliability, and that don't, go behind your back, stab you in the back, etc., etc. So, politicians have quite a bad name these days. It's very sad. One would hope that could be recovered. There have been good politicians in history, and there's nothing wrong with the polis. Polis is simply the Greek word for the city-state. We have to somehow reform the polis. Socrates didn't, run away into the woods. He stayed in the city squares of Athens, working to reform the city-state from within. And then his pupil Plato did the same by setting up the academy. And that's what academics do. We try and work to correct the errors of the assembly, the agora, the parliament, or whatever. So anyway, there was discussion in the paper I was presenting. We talked about political science. I also talked about economics and the different economic theories, and how economics is really in meltdown now, with the financial scandals of the banks, with the unethical behaviour of the banking elites being exposed, with a new commission being set up in the UK to work on bankers' malpractice, and David Cameron, the Prime Minister, having appointed Andrew Tirry, a Conservative MP for West Sussex, to actually chair this committee. And I did actually meet Andrew Tirry at his selection, during the selection process, because I was at that point living in his constituency, and he seems a man of integrity. He knows about financial markets, he knows how they operate, and hopefully, as a man of integrity, he can chair an all-party committee of inquiry into how these banks are getting away literally with malpractice, with mis-selling products, with cheating and so on. There's various ways they do it, by making the small print so complex nobody reads it, by mispresenting data, by putting on ridiculous fees to people. It's a far cry from the old days of initial founding of banking, when the founders of Barclays and Lloyds and so on were mostly Quakers who stood for integrity, truth and honour in their financial dealings. What's at stake is whether the financial system we know, that's been the dominant financial system that's been operating for a long time, loosely called liberal capitalism, premised on free markets and so on, whether that can actually cope with the real needs of real people. People need financial security, economic stability, to know that they've got a roof over their heads, food to eat, clothes, and the accoutrements of a cultured and civilized life. We all have those, I think, those needs and those fundamental rights to have that kind of human experience. That's why we're here as human beings, civilized human beings. The point of peace, of course, the hope is that if we can disinvest in the accoutrements of war and violence, there can be more resources available for a lively life of peace. Anyway, I discussed the role of economics in creating a world of peace, and the work of things like the Social Summit for Social Development, the UN process, the question of debt cancellation, all the projects that have been taken under the wing of economists, also the greening of economics that colleagues are involved with, the work of Schumacher and so on. All that comes within the span of Calliope. The Marxist kind of conversation in economics obviously was inspired by the highest ideals, the ideals of socialism and communism and cooperativism, going back to Robert Owen and the reforms of the 19th century, obviously very, very noble. In reality, when they were tried out, they led to the gulags and, the laogai, as they're called in China, the kind of enforced labour of people. Somehow freedom has to be combined with creativity, with maximising and freeing up people's intellectual and spiritual creativity, so that we are more producive as people. It's our creativity and ultimately our love that creates wealth, and somehow we have to find an economic system that generates that, and that frees up people's energies. I think one of the problems in the UK and Europe, and the reason the economies are crashing, is that it's become too much burdened with red tape and with legalism and jargon and lawyers and lawyers' fees. And to set up a company now, you have to go through 100 hoops set by little petty council officials and legal departments and bureaucracies and lawyers and so on. And basically everybody comes along and takes a slice of the pie before there is even a pie on the table. That's all totally wrong. I think what should be happening is the government gives a grant to people with a small business idea for a sustainable time, 3, 4, 5 years, to get the thing going, so that they can set up the small business. There's an absolute minimum of red tape. In fact, the government can provide the expertise to make it get done and minimise it. And then, as soon as the company comes into profitability, starts making a profit, then it can repay that loan. It can be charged at zero interest, I would say, to really kick-start. So the person needn't claim benefits. They've got a loan, which they know one day they'll pay back, like a student loan. We'll call it an entrepreneurial loan. And I think this should be available to every single adult person in Britain, and I would say even on a Europe-wide basis. Every British citizen or European citizen should be entitled to that loan, and then eventually pay it back. And I think we'd find the economy would absolutely flourish. Instead of giving benefit handouts, you'd give entrepreneurial loans to people with brilliant ideas. Okay, if the thing doesn't flourish, well, then they kind of pay it back from earnings from working for another company or whatever. Anyway, those are the kind of ideas that to me would be a peace economics. At the moment, we're spending hundreds of millions on militarism and security and the war on terror, which is it seems to me, what I was saying yesterday in this talk is that we need to be creating positive emphasis on peace rather than fighting terror. We need to be creating about a society based on love and on genius and on compassion and on vision and on wisdom. Anyway, the next muse I talked about was the muse Clio. Clio is the muse of history and education, and also the name of one of my daughters. And I mentioned that my daughter's currently doing an English workshop at Eton College, summer school, at the age of 17. I'm very proud of her, so well done, Clio. Shanty. But also, Clio is the muse of history and asks us all to look very carefully at the history of our lives, what we do with them. They're sacred, how we live them. Also, the lives of our society, our cities, our towns, our villages. The collective stored memories of a people are irreplaceable. I've said that I was inspired to do peace work by talking to old soldiers who'd fought in World War I, World War II. They told me memories of key moments in their lives, key moments in their battles. Many of them fought in D-Day or at Monte Cassino or North Africa, El Alamein, and so on. And war is a very, traumatic thing. They were still haunted by these memories. Remember one old Scotsman, Bonthron from Canada, whose ancestors had gone to Canada from Scotland, and his family had been vintners to King James I or King James VI of Great Britain, and he still didn't know why World War I had happened. He'd fought for years against the Germans. He'd never regarded Germans as his enemy. He hadn't got a clue why he'd been doing it. He'd seen hundreds of people died, their bodies sticking out of the mud of the trenches, and he still said to me, Thomas, there must be an explanation for why it broke out. Go back to Europe and find out. It was a nightmare, a madness. Go and find out and make sure it never happens again. So that's why I personally came back to Britain from Canada in 1981, was to stop World War III, inspired by these Canadian soldiers. Now, that was just their personal memories. Personal memories are very, very important. Everybody, the history of our lives is what Cleo's interested in. But she's also there for the muse of historians who are, in the old Druid days, they were the keepers of the records of the tribes when history was memorised, literally. Since Herodotus, we also write it down, and the tradition of historiography is something that I'm passionate about. I love history, and always have, ever since school. And Herodotus's book, The Histories, are also dedicated to the 9 Muses. His name means the gift of Hera, Herodotus. So, to me, history is a sacred task. It's recalling and recording the deeds of the ancestors and the ancients and our contemporaries. And I want to know, really, will Cleo look back on the 21st century and 20th century as a time when mankind lived through the traumas of 2 world wars, the Cold War? They stockpiled enormous numbers of nuclear weapons and bombs, and then eventually grew out of them. Eventually realised that they were not actually good for the planet's health or each other's health, and eventually negotiated them away and realised they were illegal and got rid of them. Or will Cleo kind of be organising trips on spacecraft from other planets, visiting a kind of stinking hulk of a former planet, saying, well, this was planet Earth, it was a beautiful place until sometime in the mid-21st century when kind of nuclear war broke out, and I'm afraid they self-destructed. I hope that it's the former, and that Cleo can remember how we transcended this urge to collective violence. I also explained in my presentation that I've been in touch with historians all over the planet working for peace, that the International Peace Research Association has a network of historians. There's Conference of Historians for Peace in Europe. There's a small group developed in Britain, particularly at the University of Sheffield. Also in Germany, there's some peace historians working. And in my own doctoral thesis on the history of peace searching from 1945 to 2001, there's a whole chapter on the historiography of peace and the history of nuclear weapons and how they were formed, how they were arrived at and agreed to in Britain and America, is also a feature of historical scholarship ongoing. And whether they should be renewed, that's the big question that we're facing as a country at the moment, and that we were discussing at this seminar. I then also then talked about Erato, who's the next muse, the muse of love and love poetry, and this is the muse really of psychology and feeling and emotion and love and its opposite, hate and jealousy and fear and so on. We can't neglect the psychological, emotional aspect of human beings. We're not simply rational actors. We're passionate, feeling creatures. We have emotions, and obviously they play a factor in war and peace. And if we're going to reach peace, it has to be also emotional peace. We have to understand the nature of love, and the argument I made in my talk is that, isn't it ironic that back in 1993 my institute launched the first ever academic journal in the world to look at the nature of love, the Muses Love Journal, and it's still, in its 12th issue, is still the only academic journal in the world to look at the nature of love, which I find completely ridiculous, given that academics love to specialise in so many branches of knowledge. So I explained how it came about, that I was travelling around the States looking for research on peace and positive aspects of relationships. I was working with the Conflict Research Society, and many people in the profession of peace research were actually emphasising conflict research. They were looking at violence, at conflict, at aggression, at psychopathology, at why people are aggressive and violent. There's a lot of research gone into that, a lot of social scientific research, a lot of funded research. The ESRC funded millions of pounds worth of research into violence. What I was arguing at the time, and still argue, is that we should counter that with research into altruism, cooperation, love, friendship, peaceableness. We should try and understand the dynamics of goodness, in effect, as well as the dynamics of evil. And so, therefore, that's why the Muses Love Journal was launched, as a kind of counterbalance to this emphasis within the peace research community on conflict and violence research. There's so many vast numbers of scholars working on security, defence, military research, and genocide and Holocaust studies, and the absolute cruelties and horrors that human beings do to each other. But there's very few looking at altruism and kindness and goodness and ultimately love. So this is an important field, and I discovered the work of a man called Professor Buscaglia, an Italian-American at the University of Southern California, who back in the 70s was teaching, and he gave seminars on psychology of education to students and was very happy. And then one day one of the students didn't show up for class, a younger woman, and he asked the other students, "Where's she gone?" And they said, "Oh dear, she committed suicide last week." And he said, "God, I had no idea." And it was like a bombshell for him. He realised that his work as an educator, he'd never really taken account of the student as a human being, and with emotional needs and feelings of their own, and that as a teacher one has a duty to help maintain the emotional tone of students and to help them as feeling beings. So he then tore up his curriculum and began teaching a course on love studies at the University of California, and he wrote a book on love, which is a classic, one of the very few works on the nature of love. I discovered this in '92 when I was travelling around the States, and I remember finding finally a copy of the book he wrote on love in a little tiny bookshop in New York City near Columbia University called Papyrus, and really treasuring that book. I've still got it. And that inspired, when I came back to Britain, for me to set up a journal on the nature of research into the nature of love, which is still going. To me, the existence of nuclear weapons is a kind of admission of failure, that we as a planet don't know how to love. We can't trust each other enough to have peace and security without weapons that can blow up millions of people. I mean, it seems to me, as a British citizen, British Canadian dual citizen, an ethical failure of our country, that why would anybody want to attack us at all? Well, surely it's because we don't love them enough, and therefore the failure in us is a spiritual, moral failure. Why did the Indian communities finally get annoyed, and why did Gandhi lead his wonderful protest to get the British out of India? It's because our diplomats and colonial administrators were not kind enough to the Indians, were not helpful enough, were not loving enough, and did things like the Amritsar massacre. The British Empire failed because of its lack of love, not, I think, anything else. So I think, as people, this country should spend a lot of money actually researching how we can become more loving people, a more loving society, rather than needing these weapons of mass destruction, which, to me, as I say, represent an ethical failure of our vision and imagination. The point I also made is that in the scriptures of the Christian faith, which is supposed to be the tradition of our country, we've just celebrated a great Jubilee of the Queen, Diamond Jubilee, with a wonderful service at St. Paul's. Well, the main Christian scriptures, they all agree on one thing, that God is love, the ultimate source behind the universe. However you define that, the ultimate Tao, the Buddha nature, the goddess, it doesn't matter what language you use, but ultimately it is love. It is a dynamic process. It's what Hegel calls the dialectical process behind the transformations of history. It's the zigzag that makes life happen. the fundamental force of attraction that makes the universe hum and sing, and that gets people motivated to do the great works they do. So that energy of love, I think, is what can bring peace ultimately. If the whole world can understand that God is love and experience it actually, not just on paper, not just in a church with somebody reading a sermon, but actually you feel they don't mean it, but actually to realise God is love, and speaks through all the prophets and all the teachers and all the saints of mankind of every faith, not just the so-called Christian faith, but what Karl Rahner calls the anonymous Christians within the whole shamanic and pagan and ancient and revealed traditions of the planet. That ultimately we realise, yes, we are love in action, all of us. We're God in evolution, so to speak, as in process theology. Then I think these weapons can be stuck in museums. We won't need them anymore after we've reached that kind of love enlightenment, if you want. Now that's basically what I said in a nutshell. Now, I know it's a lot to ask, but I don't think it's impossible, because if God is love, as I do believe, then that is implanted as a seed in all of us. The Atman of the Great Spirit is within each one of us as a microcosm. So it's not that difficult, actually, for us simply to actualise that. As a father, I know my daughters are loving, beautiful people. I didn't teach them that. They just are of themselves. Every child that's born has the capacity to love, because it's a wonderful world to be born into. This is a fantastic world, guys. You just have to get up in the morning and look at the trees, or the sun, or your partner's face, or the starry sky at night, or the wonderful books that you've got ahead of you to read. Whatever it is that you love. It's because it's impregnated, I would argue, with being itself, with the force or energy behind the universe. That's what it means when it says God is love in the scriptures. So that's the energy I think that can get rid of these nuclear weapons. And that was what I was saying yesterday, under the guidance of the Muse Erato. Then we come to the Muse Euterpe. And Euterpe is a wonderful muse. She's the muse of painting and the fine arts, the visual arts. As I explained, artists really don't want to be blown up in a nuclear Third World War. We artists like beauty, they like painting, they like colour, they like visual display. And they want to go on being able to do their art, be it sculpture, painting, architecture, garden design, fashion, everything that including the new digital arts, film, television, media, websites, the whole works. We are visual creatures, us human beings. And the work of the first speaker that she pointed to, the Targets by Joyce Kozloff, is an example of art. That happens to be quite a beautiful artwork in a strange kind of paradoxical way. And ever since the great artworks of Praxiteles and so on of the ancient world, or the great Egyptian artworks, life is about celebrating the divine patterning behind existence. In terms of the philosophy of art, if you look at the metaphysics of art, look at the work of Keith Critchlow and others, look at the work of sacred architecture, sacred geometry, these art reveals the divine code. You don't have to go to the fiction of the Da Vinci Code to realise that Leonardo da Vinci was indeed painting from a place of metaphysical insight in which the patterning behind existence is revealed through art. I explained also I just got back from the Vatican and had spent some wonderful, wonderful times going around the papal apartments, seeing the paintings of Raphael in the apartments of Pope Julius II, and revealed that I'd kind of forgotten that the School of Athens, which is the wonderful painting by Raphael of all the great philosophers in antiquity, is on one side of the room, and then opposite there's the School of Theology, which is Christ and the Apostles. Again, it's a masterpiece, and they're all doing their posing, just like on the opposing wall. So here you have pagan and Christian revelation, kind of hand in hand, and that's how I see the job of philosophy now. That the pagan wisdom of the ancients and the Christian or revealed wisdom of the revealed religions, including Islam, Judaism, and all the others, should work hand in hand for planetary survival. Then we moved on to look at the role of Melpomene, who's the muse of tragedy. Melpomene's the bad news of the planet. She's about conflict and war and genocide and Holocaust studies, but also international law and the hard cutting edge of peace studies. So studying negotiations, to get rid of nuclear weapons, to look at the international campaign to have them declared illegal, to get governments to realise that they are pretty illegal. The Scottish government at the moment is considering, that, well, if they got independence, they might actually not want these weapons around because they might well be proved to be internationally illegal. To stockpile weapons to blow up your neighbour is a borderline crime. I mean, if I'm caught by police with a huge machete in my car and it's capable of chopping up my neighbours, it's actually a criminal offence to carry dangerous weapons. Well, if as a country I'm carrying these vastly more dangerous weapons, how come that isn't a crime? So this is the kind of some of the questions international law is asking, and that's the Department of Melpomene, looking at the sad facts. It's also looking at the tradition of satyagraha, non-violence, activism for peace, bearing witness to cosmic law against human man-made laws. And so I talked about Melpomene. And in the Castle of the Muses, we have a room dedicated to Melpomene, as we do to each of the other muses, full of books to do with international law and the history of war and strategy and strategic studies, including Lawrence Freedman's work on the evolution of nuclear strategy, Lawrence Whitner's books on the history of the nuclear disarmament movement, and so on. Historians are looking at all this, and Melpomene is encouraging some international legal minds to think through whether, what are the parameters of violence in today's world, and what are the limits of violence. Okay, the next muse I talked about was Polyhymnia, who is the muse of religions. And Polyhymnia is a very important muse. She governs the work of scholars looking at religious studies and the sacred traditions of mankind. I've spoke a lot about the different world religions as a specialist in religious studies for many years, and part of my doctoral thesis was on the history of religions and the work of religious thinkers and theologians campaigning for peace in modern times. There seems to be a consensus, actually, among the great intellectual leaders of the religions that peace is much, much more preferable to war. Now, war and the courage to stand up to evil, most religions accept. There are times when you have to make a stand. Very few religions are total, absolute pacifist religions. Most religions accept that there will be times you have to stand up using some degree of force, but they all argue that has to be kept in check and in a sense under the supervision of the wisdom knowers of the day, the ethical visionaries, the seers, the priests, the prophets, whatever. And in the Celtic tradition of Britain, it was under the Druid community that the warriors were authorised to fight. The Druids would sanction the warriors to go into action. In the Christian church, it was the church, by and large, that declared a war to be a holy war, a just war, and had certain criteria which had to be met. Rowan Williams, Archbishop of Canterbury, wrote a book about those criteria in the Middle Ages that tried to sanction war. Adumnan, the great abbot of Iona, passed a law which was accepted by all the tribes of Ireland and Scotland in the 9th century to accept certain rules of war, like non-combatants should not be harmed, women and children should not be damaged, there were certain limits to environmental destruction in wartime and so on. In Islam as well, rules of chivalry, rules of justice, of correct warfare were absolutely central to the notion of Islam itself. Muhammad, although eventually the revelatory process empowered his followers to fight in defence of their faith, initially he was urged simply to respond with non-violence, but eventually, after the mocking insults and injuries done by the non-Islamic community to them, they were eventually allowed to defend themselves. But there were very strict rules of engagement, and you could not attack an unarmed man, you could not attack women and children, you couldn't attack non-combatants, you couldn't even attack a man when they were facing away from you, certainly not when they were disarmed. And So a lot of what the Christian knightly orders then adopted as chivalry rules were actually coming from Islam. There's a very famous incident when Ali once dropped a sword in the middle of a combat, and his opponent, who was fighting him from the pagan community, said, okay, expected to be killed, but Ali sheathed his sword and told his opponent to pick it up. And the opponent said, what are you talking about? You've killed, you've won, you've killed me, you've got the sword out of my hand. And Ali said, no, it's against my religion to kill an unarmed man. Pick it up and we'll carry on. And the man said, but I don't understand, you're crazy, you've defeated me, I'm at your mercy, you can kill me. And Ali said, look, my religion teaches me that there is only one reality. Ultimately, you and I are not opponents or enemies. It's your illusory misunderstanding of the nature of the unity behind all things that makes you think I'm your enemy, and therefore you're trying to kill me. I'm just defending myself because I uphold that divine unity. I'd much rather we became friends. You're my long-lost brother. But as long as you go on attacking me, I'm going to have to defend myself. And yes, if I have to, I will stop you by sadly having to kill you. But my spirit is not at war with you. I'm your friend, ultimately, if you didn't know it. That's what it means to be a Muslim. I'm surrendered to the unity of which we are all just a part. I embrace it in love. Anyway, when he said all this, the chap was so flabbergasted that he just refused to pick his sword up, and he said, look, whether you kill me or not, I don't care, but I'd much rather learn about this, so if you don't mind, I'd rather start on the path of seeking this unity, and please, can I just stop fighting now? And lo and behold, the guy eventually became a Muslim. This is a true story of what happened in the battlefield on one occasion. I'd love to know exactly the name of the other party, I don't know that. But it is a true story, and it illustrates what Islam's view was on violence. Now, it's a very far cry from that to suicide bombing and 9/11 and, all the kind of accoutrements of modern pseudo-Islamic warfare that's exposed in works like Jason Burke's amazing 9/11 Wars, which is a study of the wars since 9/11 over the last 10 or 11 years. And Bin Laden's philosophy, which is ultimately not Islamic at all. He was a cultural Muslim who was misusing Islamic teachings. He had a pseudo-grounding in them to spread an absolute distortion of Islam. He was preaching anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, anti-Christianity, anti-the West, anti-Americanism, anti-Britishness. He was just full of antis, bless him, and hadn't got a clue about what authentic Islam is. It's not about growing a beard in a certain way. It's not about praying at certain times of day. It's not about that at all. It's about having an attitude of understanding the divine unity, being surrendered to it, and realizing, like Ali, that our enemies are actually our long-lost friends, and trying to educate them. And that was the point of the truly great Islamic sages throughout history. And there is no war needed between that kind of Islam and any other faith. Indeed, it's part of the peace movement, the peace project of mankind. Anyway, that's polyhymnia. This is the kind of area that the Sacred Muse looks at, and I've taught Islamic studies, Buddhist studies, Christian studies and religious studies for many years, and so I was able to share a little bit of that yesterday. I also talked about the split between the god and the goddess, the female and male approaches to divinity. One of the things that the first speaker had talked about was how the targeting of victims on the ground from the bomb site, from a remote control computer screen hundreds of miles away where a drone's going in, removes the consciousness of the aggressor from the victim and puts it at a safe distance. And she referred to this as kind of a God's eye view of events, as in a map, you look down on it. And I said, well, that's very interesting, but what about the goddess eye view of things, which is the ground itself? If you take Gaia, the Earth, as the goddess, the living goddess of the planet, as most kind of eco-theologians do, people like Thomas Daffern and so on, the manifest reality of the Earth, as in the movie Avatar, is also sacred. The tree of life is sacred. So we want to defend her. She's our mother. She's our body, literally, as Christ said. The bread and the wine, that's our body. So we need a kind of new theology that is embracing Gaia, that is embracing life, and not seeking to destroy it from above, like some kind of extraterrestrial that doesn't care about the planet. So, from that perspective, the goddess traditions maybe represent ancient lost wisdom that we need. So this is when the American Indian traditions come in, the pagan traditions, the primal traditions, the Wiccan, the Druid, the shamanic traditions of mankind. And I explained that that's also part of the peace work that needs to be done, the healing between the god and the goddess, the healing ultimately between Zeus and Mnemosyne. This dear old couple seem to have fallen out, and so no wonder their daughters have been lost sight of. Because that's what they represent, Mnemosyne, the earth goddess, and Zeus, the kind of sky god. Those archetypes are still therefore operative in the different religious conflicts and battles. So I spoke a little bit about that, and I said that for peace we have to really heal this split. Pax herself is a goddess, and the daughter, an attendant of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, who's concerned with the manifestations of the pleasures of the material plane, but within the context of the spiritual plane. Aphrodite Urania is the goddess of the Arabian peoples and the Phoenicians, as Herodotus said. So there's an immense wealth of information one can find by looking at religious studies. And what I talked about was how religions can help bring peace. I've been active in various peace interfaith organisations for many years, studying the teachings of different religions for peace. And there are many other scholars on the planet that are doing this. But our voices collectively are not really being heard. I think what's happened is the warlords have taken over the planet. The arms manufacturers, the weapon designers, the technicians, the pseudoscientists, who aren't interested at all in spirituality. And God has become a sort of optional notion that polite society doesn't discuss. I think, as a philosopher, this is wrong. And I'm in the tradition of philosophy that thinks philosophy of religion is the kernel of wisdom. And theology was always regarded as the queen of the sciences. We need to bring God back into the equation, but maybe, with the goddess too, and actually look at the great spiritual teachings of mankind. Also explained I'm the Peace Druid of Albion and have a role in the Druid Council of Britain to uphold that ancient pagan lineages of thought, which long predate Christianity, and resolve the Stonehenge, Avebury, the ancient Neolithic peoples of Orkney, and the early shamanic hunter-gatherers that lived here on these islands. Our civilization is really the core civilization of Albion, and the question as a druid that I'm interested in, as Peace Druid of Albion, is whether these ancient peoples would approve these kind of weapons of mass destruction. If they knew they could destroy the entire planet and all human beings scattered throughout this wonderful globe, I think they would have declared them actually not ethical, and their sages and saints would have said no. If we fall out with another culture like the Afghans or something, okay, then let's have a disagreement. Let's have a single combat. Our best warrior goes up against their best warrior, and we'll see who wins. Courage is not about dropping megatonnage on cities and destroying them at a distance. It's about actually having the courage of your convictions and fighting in a courageous, direct way. And Britain has, I think, courage at its heart. And in the ancient druidical teachings, the warrior's role was very important. Finn MacCool, these other great warriors, were greatly, Cuchulainn or whatever in Ireland, were lauded. And there's a tradition of King Arthur and Lancelot and Robin Hood and so on. We have great military heroes in Britain. But ultimately they don't fight for stupid causes at the wrong time or in the wrong way. And they are under the sanction of Merlin or the Druid. And that, I think, is what I'm saying now, and this is what I was saying yesterday at this peace seminar, is that it's time to reassert the voice of the ethical visionary. And I'm a bit sad that there weren't more church leaders there, more religious faith leaders speaking about their own theologies of peace. But there we are. Then I went on and talked about the work of the muse Terpsichore, who's the muse of music. Terpsichore is a wonderful muse. She's the inspirer of Beethoven and Bach and Berlioz and the Beatles. And I'm a musician myself, a pianist and guitarist and singer. And I love music. I'm a bard. All the Druids were bards. All the great composers of history have been inspired by a kind of spiritual vision of how the world could be in harmony. I think Schubert or Bach or whatever, they have this kind of inner knowing. They can see the harmony behind existence, and they put it into music. There is something beautiful at the heart of existence. That's what music teaches us. And Howard Gardner and other great philosophers of knowledge have pointed out that in educational terms, the ability to understand music is a great gift. It's like being able to read the secret codes behind creation. So our children should be making music, not learning to make weapons of mass destruction. I think this is, and the word music is the language of the Muses. The Muses didn't speak English. They spoke in music. They sang to each other. That's the tradition that goes back to Pythagoras and Orpheus and the great Bronze Age heroes of Hellenic and European culture. That's the tradition I'm coming from here as a philosopher and a druid and a peace druid. Okay, so that was that muse, and we spoke about musicology and how scholarly studies into music are proceeding. And it seems that every plant, every tree, every living thing, even every atom emits a kind of musical note. Fascinating stuff going on. Okay, then we came to Thalia, who's the muse of literature and poetry and the arts of writing and speaking, the word, rhetoric and so on. Thalia's an amazing muse. I think she's extraordinary. I'm a poet myself. I love poetry. I love the word. I love oratory. I love public speaking. I love lecturing. That's why I love academia. And, you know, I want on behalf of all my fellow poets to see a world of peace maintained. I want there to be new Shakespeares, new Pushkins, new Dantes, new Virgils, new Hafizes, new Rumis. You know, let's keep the wheels of the Muses going. Let Thalia be triumphant over the weapons of death. If these nuclear submarine type mega weapons are allowed to survive for much longer, I'm afraid eventually they're going to just knock the poets out. We're going to die off because there'll be some kind of accident eventually. Statistics just make it obvious. And I don't want to bear the burden of not having spoken out against them. And I think the poets of the world should be standing up with one voice and saying enough is enough. Stop giving us, wars, and let's make a peace treaty. Let the religions of the world, Islam, Judaism, Sikhism, Hinduism, Christianity, paganism, Druidry, the whole lot, let's make a peace treaty that we will not fight and kill and destroy each other. Instead, we'll have poetry contests. Why not bring back the Delphic Games, which were parallel to the Olympic Games, when the great poets of Hellas used to compete in rivalry for their olive crowns? Well, they do this still at Struga, and the Struga Poetry Festival in Macedonia, which I was invited to 3 times, and didn't yet win the award, however. This is terrible. Hopefully, eventually. Ted Hughes won it once, and Pablo Neruda won it, so okay, I'll wait a bit. Anyway, the point is poetry, the pen is mightier than the sword, and this is the witness of Thalia. And the great poets of the world should be writing poetry. In the old days, poetry was like magic. You wrote the thing and it came to pass. It's about the art of manifestation, what some people call the law of attraction or the secret. And so poetry is the manifestation of the energy that makes things manifest. If you write the poem, it comes to pass. So we should be writing as creative bards and poets. We should be writing the poems of peace that will manifest. But for that we have to vision the peace, make it as exciting and creative and interesting as war. I was very interested yesterday at this academic blockade how much traffic was coming in and out of the base. Thousands of dozens of cars, vehicles, even little troop ships, all kinds of activity going on. War's terribly exciting. This is all because people are making great weapons of mass destruction, and that creates all kinds of economic activity. It's very exciting. When are we going to have a peace space that's as exciting and generating as much traffic, so to speak? Well, that's a job for the poets. We have to make peace seem as exciting. And that is a problem, because too often war is the big story. If you switch on the news, there's a bomb, hundreds of people die, well, that's big news. There's a fete somewhere, and babies have a running race, and young men and women fall in love, and people play piano and have dancing sessions. That's not news. That's boring. That's peace. Well, okay, poets have got to somehow... I think people like Thomas Hardy and the other great poets, Wallace Stevens, Rilke, T.S. Eliot, they explored, and the metaphysical poets, Donne and Herbert, what they were able to say is that actually being itself is complex enough to make it so interesting. Wallace Stevens deconstructs reality. Rilke deconstructs the mind in such a complex way that consciousness is revealed as far more exciting than unconsciousness. That peace is not peace. It's bubbling away, seething with a mass of complex, contradictory phenomena. It's a bit like the Higgs field that we thought was just empty. Oh, that's just Higgs. That's emptiness. Well, it's not. It's bubbling away with these little particles that have just been detected. To me, that's a symbol, actually, of the search for peace. The peace particle is the one we've been looking for all along, and it's in the thing that we thought was empty and boring. Actually, it's the field itself, which is full of creative potential. It's the void, as Nagarjuna, the great Buddhist, put it, the shunyata out of which everything manifests. And all contraries and opposites and dialectical polarities all manifest from it. That, the one point, as Wilbur calls it, the one taste of peace. Now that's not boring. That's awesome. That's the source of all possible excitement in the universe. So and galaxies manifest from this thing. The Higgs particle. I'm proposing the peace particle, which is what the Higgs particle is actually made of here. That was Thalia, and that was great fun, sharing my passion for language and poetry, and novels and literature and plays and so on. Then we moved on. I talked about Urania, who is finally the ninth muse of science, natural science, mathematics, physics, chemistry, material science, astronomy, etc., and astrology and esoteric sciences, but everything to do with the natural world, medicine, biology, ecology, anthropology, and so on. Now look, people active in the sciences all over the planet. We have scientists coming to the castle of the Muses here, and Urania is a very important muse. She guards the work of scientists, but she's pretty concerned to make sure they're doing ethical work, because science, knowledge itself is a neutral force. Knowledge can be used for death or life. I mean, I was a friend of the late Professor Cedric Smith of University College, who was a great mathematical geneticist who was appointed by Lord Haldane, or Professor Haldane, to the chair of mathematical genetics at University College, and he supported the launch of my Peace Institute in its early days. He told me about a chap called Verschuer, who was one of the founders of genetics, who was the academic supervisor of Mengele, who was doing experiments in Auschwitz on Jewish inmates. And they were doing all kinds of horrendous things to them, cutting them up, making them die slowly, grafting different bits of bodies onto the wrong bits, and so on, seeing how long it takes to die. And he was writing all this stuff up and sending it to Verschuer. And incredible thing is, after the war, Mengele was never caught, hid in South America, and Verschuer was rehabilitated as a scientist and carried on, doing his so-called academic scientific work, because in his circle nobody was interested in ethics. And the fact that he'd supervised Mengele, well, nobody cared about that. And Cedric told me he was absolutely appalled. He was a Quaker and a peace scientist, and he couldn't believe that these scientists got away with it. Science can be used by the Verschuers and the Mengeles, and they still pretend it's science. So Urania needs very much to listen to the voice of philosophers and ethicists and people like Einstein and Roadblock, who've campaigned for ethical action on the part of science. And this is where Urania gets twitchy. And I think what's going on in the world today is that a model of science has been peddled as if it's authentic science, which is it's value-free, it's neutral, it doesn't take a stand on ethical issues, and so on and so on. It just exists, knowledge for its own sake. No, knowledge it comes with a casing, a protective casing, and it's about benevolence and altruism and the advancement of people's well-being. The point of being a doctor is, after all, to heal people, not simply to know about medicine and then sit back and watch people die of suffering. No, it's to intervene, and it's that compassion bit which a doctor has, which makes them a good healer. It's not how much they know about your condition. There are some doctors that are very clever and know a lot about medicine, but they're actually terrible doctors, because they're not very kind, they're not very nice, they're not very compassionate, and they don't actually care whether you live or die or get healed. Especially in today's world, it's just you tick a box, and if the patient dies, you tick died. It doesn't matter. There's no human component. This is not a proper doctoring. So, I've worked with scientists for peace and global responsibility with Professor Tom Kibble of Imperial College, and I worked with Cedric Smith and other scientists. Maurice Wilkins, the co-founder of DNA, was one of the people that appointed me to the original feasibility study that led to the birth of my Institute of Peace Studies. So I have a great respect for science and scientists, but on the condition that it is aware of its ethical duties. And so I ran through these 9 muses and ended up with uranium and talked about the role of nuclear physicists, particle physicists, the role of CERN, and I kind of, not completely jokingly, I said we needed a kind of new science of peace that's as important and as valued as what CERN does. We need to find the peace particle at the heart of the mystery of being alive. And somehow we need to unthink the conceptual frameworks that gave rise to the nuclear weapons. We can't just get rid of them by just willing them away or asking politely. They came for a reason. At the end of World War II, the Manhattan Project, the great scientists of the Allies got together to invent these weapons of mass destruction, actually in fear of the Nazis getting them first. And it was the fear of absolute destruction that motivated them, Oppenheimer and people. Now, paradoxically and tragically, they were used twice at the end of World War II, and hopefully would never be again, but we have to get rid of them by unthinking the conceptual frameworks in which they were given birth to. What we need is a greening of science. This is the work of the Global Green University, which is run from the castle here, looking at ecological sciences, how knowledge is part of an interconnected whole. It's the advancement of learning's second edition. I'm proposing that in 2024, on the anniversary of Sir Francis Bacon's advancement of learning, we launch a new advancement of learning project. We do a re-audit of what is known. We work with scientists around the planet, the Royal Society, and its equivalents in all other countries, and do a re-audit of the totality of human knowledge, and look again at what gaps we have. There's so much we still don't know. Science is wonderful. Science is exciting. Science of peace is the most incredibly exciting thing we can be doing. Yet, so many scientists are funded by military research. This is absurd and tragic, and we need to rethink the funding parameters of scientific research in our universities, in our scientific research institutions. So much of it is based on militarism. So how are we going to change that? And I've sat on commissions at the UN headquarters and so on discussing this. And there are groups now campaigning through the UN to get universities to take their peace promotional work seriously, and the work of scientists for peace around the planet, is important. So that was the final news. After I finished this, I then summarised by saying, quoting Sir Francis Bacon, saying that, okay, all knowledge, as he said, is like a winding stair, and we advance but slowly. And I said that I hoped in conclusion that in this seminar my talk had helped advance the knowledge of peace just a little bit further. up a few notches of the winding stair. So then, after I finished, there was, a little bit of discussion, and then we moved on to the next speaker. This was a man called Dr. Hugh Hubbard, who spoke very eloquently, and we all spoke for about 20 minutes each. And he's from the University of Leeds. He works at the Polymer International Research Centre, which is a consortium of the universities of Leeds, Bradford, Durham and Sheffield, although he's based at the University of Leeds. And fascinating, a materials scientist. He did his work, initially he did a physics degree at the University of Oxford, and then he worked in his first PhD on the chemistry of nuclear fission, and looking at nuclear reactions and so on, but from a chemical perspective. And he's subsequently gone on and had a long career in the sciences. And he spoke very movingly, actually, about why he felt, as a scientist, as an academic, that nuclear weapons were bad news for the planet. He spoke about the fact that each one of the Trident submarines that Britain has, and there are about 4 that are operational, 2 of which are at sea at any time, I believe, has 49 warheads. And that each of these 49 warheads carries a bomb capable of killing 10 million people if targeted on an urban population. And the total killing power of one of these submarines is therefore 500 million people. Which is a sobering thought. He began his talk really with this observation. And he went through the history of the evolution of weaponry. He said the first gun that ever fired and killed somebody was at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. I'd been having a conversation with him on the way up to the seminar. He'd been dressed in his green academic robes with his proper academic hat on, as befits a doctor of the academy. These wonderful medieval-looking robes that we occasionally dress up in. He'd remembered to bring his. And we were talking about, I was saying that wouldn't it be wonderful if the British Army could go back to using the longbow? After all, the longbow had been a very successful weapon, and it would be very good practice for the young men of Britain to have to train again with it. And, back to the days of Agincourt. Anyway, he mentioned in his talk that in 1415 at the Battle of Agincourt had been the first time a gun had killed somebody in war. And then he explained how, since Agincourt, weapons have become so vast, and that the largest kind of bombs that were around in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo were a kiloton in size. In World War II, there were 1,000 times that, 10 tons size bombs. And then in Hiroshima, 10 times that, 10 kilotons worth of bombs at Hiroshima. And then soon after that, in 1952, 10 megaton bombs were available. So each time it's going up in huge leaps and bounds. And now we have bombs that are just so vast, it beggars the imagination in potentiality. So one bomb dropped, say, on Durham would also destroy Leeds and Bradford and Sheffield and Manchester, etc. And we have these submarines that we're outside the base discussing this out at, with 49 of these warheads. So we could take out 49 vast urban centres around the world if Britain suddenly was taken over by a mad dictator bent on world destruction. Why should a human being have such awesome firepower at their disposal? How can we guarantee that it would never be used? I mean, the theory is it's never to be used apart from in self-defence or in retaliation, but it's a ridiculous thought that anybody should have that power. He went on to talk about his work in Scientists Against Nuclear Arms, SANA, how it had campaigned back in the 80s, 90s and so on. He then talked about some of the accidents that happened. He talked about an Operation Able Archer that took place in 1983, when there was a mistake. There was an alarm system went off, and it was thought that the Soviets were launching an attack on the West, and the countdown to retaliatory action went very, very far down the line and nearly launched a Third World Nuclear War. This was repeated back in 1995 with a NATO exercise, when NATO was firing a rocket, a split-level rocket, as a trial run. In the event of a real nuclear war, Hugh explained, the first thing you do is you take out the communication potentials of your opponent. So you detonate a vast nuclear explosion above Moscow, which generates a wave of interference that destroys immediately all communication systems, computers, telephones, mobile phones, the whole thing, satellite communications, are all destroyed by this vast explosion. And it's generated somewhere up in the air, mile or so above Moscow. And it's delivered by a particular rocket with a particular payload. And NATO, in 1995, was practicing this as if it was a real thing. And they fired, such a kind of dummy rocket, but it didn't have the right, obviously it didn't have an actual warhead on it. Anyway, the Russian listening stations picked this up, and they recognised what it was. The signals knew what this incoming thing was. I'm not quite sure how high above the atmosphere it was. And Yeltsin's generals worked out that this was a first strike coming at them, which was going to take out their communication control centres, and therefore they had to authorise that the theory was you immediately retaliate. When you see that thing coming, you fire your stuff before it comes. And the generals therefore went to Yeltsin and said, look, we think we're under attack, it's coming in a few minutes, we have to fire back now. The protocols were that the response should be immediate. Yeltsin, fortunately, simply did not believe them, and he refused to order the retaliation. Just simply refused. And it turned out he was right. It was an exercise, and it wasn't a real threat. But the generals actually said, no, it is, and you must fire the retaliation now. So really, the fact that the world's still here, and that we humans are still here having these seminars at Faslane, is down to Yeltsin simply telling the generals he didn't believe them. Now, that's the story that Hugh told yesterday. I can't vouch for the details. I'm not familiar with that story, but it's a scary story. And I'm sure that Hugh's done his research and knows what he's talking about. And we're fortunate that Yeltsin wasn't drunk on that occasion, because he might have made another choice. Hugh then talked about morality and about the Ten Commandments, and he talked about spirituality to some extent. As a scientist, he's brought up an Anglican and still had an affection for philosophy and ethics, although he was a materials scientist. And he wondered, he speculated, look, if Moses was getting the Ten Commandments now, would they be in the same form, or would God update them? In the Ten Commandments, there's a stipulation, thou shalt not kill. Now, human beings haven't been very good at keeping this commandment. We find all kinds of reasons to kill. We kill because it's the death penalty. We kill because we're soldiers. We kill because it's a crime of passion, etc., etc. So we're not sticking to even that one. But compared to the real needs and problems facing the planet, what Hugh said is that if Moses were to come down from the mountain now, he might want to bring an 11th commandment. And that God would say, look, I've got an update to give, because, I told you earlier, thou shalt not kill. Well, by and large, you're sticking to that. But there's a new one here, which is, thou shalt not plan or conceive or threaten to destroy the entire planet Earth and all living beings. It's not just no longer killing individuals. We now have the potential for omnicide, as John Somerville called it, the potential to kill the entire planet. And that surely has an even greater negative sanction in the new commandments, if the 11th commandment's added, than in those first 10. So the 11th commandment Hugh proposed, and he looked a bit like a Moses in his academic gown, is, "Thou shalt not plot or threaten to destroy planet Earth." So I think that's a good one. I think we should update the 10 commandments and include this 11th one. He then talked about some of the interesting constitutional questions about control of Trident submarines and the nuclear weapons. They're at sea all the time, these massive killing machines, which are the apex of man's capacity for mass killing. Right back from the first stone axe used in anger, through the bow and arrow, up through the gun, we come to Trident with the huge firepower. Now, in the old days, the ethical control put on the use of weapons was by the shaman or the druid or the wizard or whatever, or the priest or the sage or the Sufi or the imam. Who controls it now? Well, apparently there's a letter on these underground submarines at sea authorising their use, because if Britain has been attacked or destroyed in a nuclear exchange by a foreign power, we need to retaliate within about 4 minutes or so. And so the submarine won't have time to ring Downing Street or ring Britain. It may not be able to ring because it might have already been destroyed. So what there are apparently on these submarines is a letter from the Prime Minister authorising, in the event of certain codes being received, when the red buzzer comes on, you open the letter, and the letter says, yes, you are now hereby authorised to count down to final deployment. Please, the targets are XYZ. What Hugh was asking, and I think it's a very interesting question, is that letter presumably is authorised by each incoming Prime Minister, so they send a new letter out. The question he wanted to know was, is it also authorised by the Queen? Because the Queen is the head of the armed forces, not the Prime Minister. And it's ultimately the Queen, or the head of state, the Queen or the King, who has the final right to say yes or no to the use of nuclear weapons. And what he wanted to know, and I'm not sure any researchers know this really, I suppose one would have to ask the Queen, is has she authorised the use of nuclear weapons in her name, and if so, under what criteria? Because she's also the head of the church. And Hugh was asking, from a Christian perspective, the thought that one has issued like a pre-check to enable some submarine commander to destroy 100 million people around the planet seems to be at variance with the fact that you're supposed to be upholding the wisdom of Christ and the church, whose teaching is that God is love. There seems to be a disjunct here. And if God is love, how can God want the mass killing of 100 million people? There's a problem. And Hugh just asked the questions, really. And what he asked was whether the monarch might want to rethink whether they give that blanket permission, and whether constitutionally they'd be able to. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, we got a monarch in Britain who actually didn't like nuclear weapons, didn't want on their conscience the mass killing of millions of people, and therefore decided not to sign the letter. Would that be allowed constitutionally? What would the government of the day do? Would they do a coup? Would they blackmail the monarch into signing it? Would they force them behind the scenes? Or would they say, well, you can choose, you can be head of the church or head of the government, you can't be both, so you can go off and be some kind of saint-type monarch, but leave real governance to us and we'll do the nuclear weapons? I don't know. Or might it be possible? Let's just say King Alfred came back on the throne, some spiritually enlightened monarch, and said, actually, no, I've thought this through. I'm a Christian spiritual leader as well as a monarch. I'm a righteous king. I don't think it's fair to threaten to blow up hundreds of millions of people. We're going to get rid of nuclear weapons. Sorry, folks. We're going to turn Trident submarine bases into tourist attractions, and we're going to run Trident submarines as tourist cruises. We'll take you around the world. You pay a lot of money. You come and see a nuclear sub, but we're going to disarm them. Keep them running as a kind of tourist floating hotel or something. would that monarch be allowed to get away with it? Would we allow the divine conscience of kings? This is what Hugh was saying. In the old days, Charles I invoked the concept of the divine right of kings against Parliament. He lost the argument because he simply lost the war. He didn't necessarily lose the argument. What Hugh is saying, and I think he's a sort of a secret royalist, actually, he's saying the king has a right to have their own conscience, irrespective of what the ministers say. And if the Christian monarch of Britain decided nuclear weapons were wrong, then that wish should be respected. We discussed afterwards, and I said, yes, I thought Charles's mistake had been to emphasise the divine right of kings as opposed to the divine duty of kings. The phrase he should have used was the divine duty of kings. And that's within the tradition of David and all the Davidic monarchy that sees kingship as a sacred duty. I also told Hugh I'd myself taken an initiative through my institute of creating a council of monarchs, or proposing that there be set up a council of monarchs, in which the reigning monarchs of the planet, all 32 of them, should come together annually and discuss their potential contribution to planetary well-being and healing and so on, and environmental and educational work. So he liked that idea, and anyway, Hugh posed these very important questions in his paper about the divine right of conscience, and we talked about that ethical issue afterwards. So anyway, that was Hugh's talk. It was a masterpiece, and he's a very earnest and wise scientist, but also an ethical thinker and philosopher. Then we had a talk from Dr. Dave Webb, who teaches peace studies and security studies at the university. I think it was in Leeds Metropolitan University. David come up all the way from Yorkshire for this seminar, and he began by commenting on my talk. He said that he knew a physics teacher in California who was also interested in research into the nature of love, as I'd called for in my talk, and had identified some kind of particle of which love is made, and called Linda Williams, and urged me to contact her. And anyway, then he went into his main talk, and he gave his own autobiography a little. He said he'd used to work for the after his degree in science, physics, I think. He then worked for the MOD briefly, Ministry of Defence, and he worked in the Directorate for Scientific and Technical Intelligence. And what they were doing was this was back in the, I think, 70s or 60s, and they were looking at how weapons development is proceeding apace, both in Britain and among enemy countries. In those days it was the USSR. And what Dave said his job was, he was paid to think through what nasty weapons the Soviets might be dreaming up, and also to look at intelligence that might have come in about what kinds of weapons they were actually making. And so then his job was to then invent weapons that could possibly counter those weapons. So the Director of Scientific and Technical Intelligence of the MOD was always trying to stay ahead of the game, to outthink what the enemy was doing, and also to think through worst case possible scenarios. What's the worst kind of weapon those other guys could be making at the moment? And then to have already outthought them, like in a chess game, and to have created something that could defeat even those worst case type things. Anyway, Dave said he did this for a while, and then he suddenly had a kind of revelation. He realised that what he was doing was adding to the sum total of suffering and misery in the world through misusing his scientific and technical knowledge. Because what he was doing was exploring worst possible things, and just as other scientists, the other side of the Iron Curtain in Moscow or Beijing, were doing the same thing, and visioning what he was doing. And so they were having this like negative race of negative energies, each trying to come up with nasty things to do to each other. And after a while he just said, look, I can't do this anymore. My conscience won't let me. This is not what I trained as a scientist to do. And instead he then went into working in civilian science. And he then went on to comment about, in his view, that kind of negative worst-case thinking which underlies the nuclear weapons industry and other weapons of mass destruction is an extension of the fundamental bullying nature of our society. He said that bullying is at the root cause of a lot of the problems on the planet. Kids get bullied in schools, particularly, negative peer pressure means that anyone interested in actually studying and learning and asking deep questions often gets bullied and mocked. But also people get bullied in institutions, in organisations, in companies. Even in academia, there's tremendous bullying goes on between rival professors and turf wars and so on. And what Dave said is that the ultimate kind of bullying is to have nuclear weapons, because what you're saying is we're the biggest guy on the block. We'll bully you if you fall out of line. And what Dave asked is, how can we unthink our capacity and need to bully each other? Isn't there a way to actually communicate in a loving and friendly and clear, yes, sometimes assertive way, but never discourteously, never bullyingly? He then went on to talk about his interest in the kind of the networks of violence and war. He's saying, okay, there are nuclear submarines here at this base in Faslane, but actually they're just part of a very, very large network of militarised bases around the planet with a vast economic industry behind them. And there are some in Britain like RAF Fylingdales or Menworth Hill, which are listening stations, some of which are not even under the control of the British people. The Fylingdales, ostensibly an RAF base, is actually controlled from the USA, and it's a listening station for the Americans, i.e. the people of the USA, to get advance warning of missiles coming at them. And Dave said this was missold to the British people as if it was of use for us, but in fact it was always along intended to be of use for the USA. And he felt that government lies to its people, that the government lied to the British people in the whole acquisition and development of nuclear weapons, and particularly this Fylingdales base, which to this day is out of bounds to people from Britain itself. He also stated that America has about 1,000 military bases overseas, and therefore, things like RAF Fylingdales have to be seen in that light. And so we're dealing, and it's worth remembering, of course, that Britain's Trident nuclear weapons come from America. We simply kind of hire them or buy them off them. The technology is fundamentally American, although the original Manhattan Project was partly inspired by British scientists as well. They collaborated. He also talked about the missile defence system, Star Wars, and how it had proved to be a costly white elephant. It had now been scaled down to the idea of theatre missile defence systems, and was being sold to people in Poland and Romania as a very good thing by Obama. But that he suspected this was really a false reliance on the hubris of technological power when America was failing, in spite of all this expenditure and all these bases and all this technical superiority, in actually winning hearts and minds in Iraq or the Middle East or Afghanistan. The USA has spent $1 trillion on fighting the war in Afghanistan, said Hamid Karzai recently, and yet has not won the loyalty and affection of the Afghan people. They still are furious with America. And the Taliban types are still there. I mean, it seems to me it would have been far, far more profitable and cheaper. I didn't say this at the time, it was Dave's show, but to have expended a tiny fraction of that $1 trillion on educational work, on aid, on cultural, advancement and so on. Dave talked about the Pacific pivot, Obama's new strategy of militarizing the Pacific, and vast bases are coming into being like the one in South Korea, in Jeju Island, where a World Heritage Site of UNESCO has been turned into one of the largest military bases on the planet. Local people are protesting, but of course it has no impact, and it's just going ahead. And Dave said that things like the Faslane Peace Camp and these academic protests are good because they're going on all over the planet. Wherever militarism is creating its infrastructures of death and killing, ordinary people are getting up and saying enough is enough. So Dave spoke very well and movingly, and also explained that he's now involved in a peace studies course at the University of Leeds, and if anyone wants to get involved and study there, they're very welcome. Then Kelvin Mason, who was chairing the seminar, summed up, and he'd been summarising as we went along. Kelvin had introduced the conference and the seminar, and then had responded to each speaker. Kelvin then summarised the whole thing and said it had been a fascinating discussion. He summarised saying that the question was how we could create an artwork for peace, and that really some people had said that maybe nuclear weapons are out of date, or Trident submarines, but actually maybe violence itself is what is out of date. Maybe we should be looking to non-violence as an alternative way of solving problems. He thanked the people of Faslane Peace Camp for keeping going. They're in their 30th year. It's happy birthday time for them. Kelvin thanked them for their witness over the years, their dedication. Although personnel have come and gone, there's always been a core group of people living at the base. Kelvin talked a bit about his work as an academic at the University of Cardiff. He's an environmental geographer, interested in environmental politics and ethics. He's written works on climate change and social methodologies of knowledge and so on. And he's also the Peace News editor for Wales. So he summed up the conference, and at the end we all finished our formal seminar. So the academic seminar as a whole ended at this point. We broke up into smaller groups discussing, and as I say, about 20-30 people were there. BBC filmed part of this, and occasionally got talking to some of the police. I spoke to the police commander who'd been controlling the police at this event, and asked if there were any guided tours of the Faslane base, whether local people or whoever could go round officially and have a look. Given that some people have broken in unofficially and been arrested, I said, well, why can't we just go and have a look? I'd be interested. And one of the policemen said he thought there was an open day when you could go round. I then asked the chap, I was directed to ask the chap who's the senior police officer there, and he then negatived that. He said, no, there are no open days, and no, you can't have a tour. So I will pursue that one. Maybe there are ways of having a look. I do think that since the British people are paying for this base in the millions, that I think there should be at least one open day a year when people can go round and see what they're up to. Anyway, it was a fascinating day. Thank you to all the people that participated. I was simply one of the speakers, and I'm sure other people will post their experiences. I hope I've done justice to the talks that were given, and it was a pleasure to meet everybody, and well done to the Faslane Peace Camp for organising the whole thing, and to Kelvin Mason for chairing it. So thank you all for listening, and may the Muses continue to inspire you in your own contribution and your own work for peace and knowledge advancement, in whatever form that takes. Thank you.